Okay, let's slowly get started. Luca, if you would like to join me here, turn on your wonderful. Hi there. Let's see how well this is going to work. We had not we, just me, had some computer issues, some connectivity issues when we were trying this out. But as you know, we have a backup. So even if I drop out, Irene will be in the back end and help us out here. Luca, thank you so much for your presentation. That adds yet another perspective to what we've been doing over 10 days. And as you say in the beginning, you're not talking directly about the COVID-19 crisis, and that was actually part of the intention for this conference, to say we are in the middle of a global crisis, but what does that mean for our reflections in general about the idea of crisis? And you have been putting extensive amount of research into a particular crisis for several years now. And that is the situation in Sarajevo from during the siege. And what I wanted to ask you as to start the conversation before people are posting their questions, joining in here, was to say maybe you can situate yourself a little bit. We talked about this before. People assume, don't ask that question, you said, because people assume that you have a particular role in this and that is why you're researching it. And maybe that's not the case. So I'm wondering whether you can tell us a little bit more about why you're investing research into this.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And I hope you can hear me well. And thank you so much for organizing this conference. It's been wonderful to watch so many engaging and relevant talks over the past 10 days almost. So as I told you in private earlier, a lot of people just generally assume that given the fact that I'm working on Siege of Sarajevo and that I tend to speak the language of the locals, that I was there during that time, and this is not the case at all. I actually, during the time of the siege, I grew up in Belgrade, which was the capital of former Yugoslavia, and at that point the capital of Serbia. So I was actually on the side that perpetuated the aggression that led to the siege. The reason why I initially started looking at Sarajevo is I thought that it was an interesting context. I grew up in a sort of multicultural Yugoslav spirit, and Bosnia always held that tradition as almost the birthplace and the cradle of that multiculturalism. And I thought that in the age of ethno-nationalist states, if we're going to defend it and stand up for multiculturalism, we have to do it again in this setting. So I thought that it would be important to do research in Sarajevo and to try to portray this siege in a more complex light than it was portrayed. You have two dominant discourses, one of these passively suffering people who were subjected to grenades, and then the other discourse, which is discourse of, the siege was perpetuated in somebody's name and with some reasons. And I thought that, whether or not they're correct and how correct these discourses are, there is the situated experience of a very, very large number of children and young people who all of a sudden, just like us a few months ago, found themselves living in this very very different reality, and they lived through it, and they developed, and they went through some of the most formative years of their lives in the conditions of siege, and they didn't only passively suffer. They actually lived their lives during this time. And I think that the reason why I wanted to present that even in this conference, and why I say at the beginning that I'm not directly talking about COVID-19, because honestly, I can't put it together yet, how I feel about the crisis that's ensued due to the outbreak of the disease. But I thought that I would offer this as an example of a situation where life goes on. Life goes on in spite the 1,000 afflictions that might come in its way. The second reason why I started doing research with the siege of Sarajevo is more theoretical. I've been generally working within the field of psychology of immigration prior to starting this work, where a person migrates from a context A into context B. And generally in psychology of immigration, you're looking at how this influences change. Here, people didn't go anywhere, but the context around them changed. So they more or less remained in place. And I thought that this would be interesting, and this would give me a lens on the role of space and environmental context on the people. So we would hold the environment constant, but the social structures around it and environment would change due to the war.
I want to talk a little bit more to you about how, because this is one of the aspects that we haven't discussed that much in the conference so far, those radical environmental changes. But let's go there in a moment. Before that, I want to shed some light on the narrative aspects of your talk. And I think there are many, and they're multi-layered, and there may be also adding new arguments to what we have discussed before, because you have in the language that others have used, you are talking about certain master narratives here that are suddenly changing, and you have lots of small stories also on the ground. One of the beautiful small stories that you start out with, the post office. I was wondering whether you could talk about this a little more, because it's such a, I mean, you chose that story for a particular reason. It's emblematic, maybe in a particular way, that there is a claim, and then also that it's the post office. I mean, I don't want to go too far with this metaphor, but claiming the post office in such a situation means something, because it's the communication to the outside, right. The communication right. Coming in. It's claimed by one side, it's claimed by the other side, and then the claims are ridiculed in the next step. So maybe we can speak about that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to start with that is I wanted to somehow bring in a foil which would allow me to highlight the main aspects of my work, which look at the environmental context and language. And this almost like semantic layer that exists there. So this graffiti exchange I always thought was very interesting, because it gave you a quick lens into how language was used to make certain nationalist claims over the space that actually has a very functional purpose, like the post office. As you say, I'm not sure that they were really intending to, that they were that bright to think that they're claiming the post office as a means of communication. I think that it's interesting. I also, the space of the post office is very interesting, because it was built during the Austro-Hungarian occupation of Bosnia prior to the start of the First World War, and it's almost like this colonial space, which also introduces certain aspects of modernity into this very post-Ottoman context. So I think it, I could have probably went deeper with that metaphor, but in terms of narrative, I don't. I generally try to stay within the aspect of narrative that looks at sort of everyday narratives and what Michael Bamberg called in the past small stories, where I don't necessarily use them as I don't collect this discursive aspects. I do it more as reflections or as situated narratives that are addressed to somebody through this letter writing and other prompts that are addressive, that are meant to elicit a narrative in a particular direction. In order to show generally, I mean, my theoretical direction is in order to show within person heterogeny, this idea that we have one stable identity, one stable sense of self that we carry through life is not necessarily something that I tend to be that I tend to see as resonating as real in my life, at least.
it's another interesting aspect of the multi-layered story that you're offering here. And I mean, what I find personally particularly fascinating, again, is then what you alluded to before, the way in which space is transformed, the way in which you describe the city that has been going through several transformations in the past already, right? Ottoman occupation, an Olympic city, a communist city, a war city, all these changes happening so quickly. And then at the same time, you show us pictures of people standing next to what resembles something like a tank, or at least a protected UN vehicle in the street, and obviously waiting for something, like as if they were waiting for a bus, but they're waiting for this car to pass, this vehicle to pass the street so that they can follow. So there's, in many ways, everyday life going on in the face of radical environmental change. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to how you integrate in your research this radical change on the ground, the environment, while some things stay the same, and yet others change. Also, maybe with respect to the data that you have, that the narratives that people have offered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I explored this in two different ways. First of all, I tried to look at the situated experiences of individuals who, as young people, grew up in Sarajevo and lived through the siege. So in general, my research paradigm asked them to write a number of narratives that were all directed, letters directed towards real or imaginary audience. So they wrote a narrative about their experience pre-war in Sarajevo, experiences during the siege, and experiences after the siege. In order to, and each time I tried to sort of situate these letters in a way that they would explore environment to a certain extent. So the pre-war narrative asked them to write a letter to a person younger than themselves, who doesn't remember Sarajevo before the war, and describe one day in their life in Sarajevo during the war. Setting for the siege asked them to describe one school day during the time of the siege, or one educational opportunity, and then post-war letter asked them to describe how the city has changed since the war ended. So there's that, and then also another part of the research that I sort of just alluded to at some point is that I looked at archival data on the educational practices. I was really fascinated by the fact that schooling maintained its function throughout the entire siege. And I think, if there's anything that sort of frustrates me about this moment today is of the crisis of that we are thrust into, is this debate about whether schooling and educational institutions should continue to work, and the sort of hesitance of people to engage in educational activities. I mean, we have a situation of war with 350 grenades falling every day, and children are going to school, and teachers are crossing the streets in order to get to the physical location of the schools. There are radical transformations within the way that schooling was conducted. Classes were not segregated by age, so you would have children from 7 to 15 years of age sitting in the same classroom. In the moments when there is extreme bombardment of the city, when children cannot venture outside, which is something that we also see today, the school is broadcast via radio. But again, teachers are going to the building of the Radio Sarajevo, which is not very conveniently located in the city, to broadcast their lectures, trying to maintain some semblance of a life that existed before, and give the young people some sense of structure and some tools to make sense of what is going on in their lives at that point. So it sort of frustrates me these days when I hear the arguments that education should not necessarily be foregrounded, and that yeah.
We've been talking at the conference also about the way in which COVID-19 is approached with the war metaphor. And I find it really interesting that you now talk about the actual war situation, right? So there's not the metaphor, there is the war out there. And at the same time, you bring in Amina Pilav's concept of unwar spaces. And I find that super interesting in connection to what you just said, the schools as unwar spaces. And also you mentioned some other examples. Can you maybe speak a little bit more about that, and maybe also, if that's possible at all, relate this idea of unwar spaces to our current situation? Maybe this is a metaphor that we could use to counter the war metaphor of COVID-19.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you very much. Yeah, so Armina Pilav offers this very important and very apt observation and theoretical paradigm of a bifurcated city, a city that, especially during the time of the siege, is split vertically. On one level, you have this very dangerous overground city, which is often a high-risk battlefield, where usually people didn't want to spend too much time in it. Even those pictures or photos that I had in the talk perhaps misrepresent a little bit, because they're taken during the times of the ceasefires, which were rare, where people are getting haircuts outside, they're washing their clothes outside. These are really rare periods of the siege. Most of the time, the overground city was extremely dangerous, and many people did not want to spend much time in it. There's also a gender divide there, where the overground city was much more male dominated during this time, which is also, I think, very interesting, but not surprising, given that war is a quite gender polarized activity often. Then there's the underground city, where most of the reactions to civilian reactions to wartime aggression happened. So most of the time, people try to maintain some semblance of pre-war life or construct reactions and reimagine their life underground. Quite often, the basements in the sort of socialist part of Sarajevo, which were previously used to, store your bicycles and your old shoes, became spaces where you would socialize. There is a quite interesting story, because a lot of children spent a lot of times in the basements, where the space for children's game is constricted. There's not much space to run around. They played board games quite intensely, and there is this case of Bosnia Chess Club, where 4 children got so good at chess in the basements that they were actually convoyed to Paris in the beginning of 1995 to compete in the European Championship, and actually did quite well in this environment. So in addition to that, there is schooling underground, there are social activities underground. So similarly to the way that now most of our social life is being forced online, because we are living in these situations of lockdowns and are being isolated and confined to our own spaces. So there's again a bifurcation. It's just a technical bifurcation. At that time, most of social life happened underground.
Before I turn to the questions that are coming in here, I want to follow up on this a little bit, and the story that you just gave us, to say, okay, so people engaged in certain activities given the limitations, but then also maybe given the new spaces that necessarily opened up, playing chess, developing certain skills. The typical kind of mainstream, maybe if we want to, psychology expectation would be post-traumatic stress disorder. And I understand your research as an argument also against that, and saying, no, this is not necessarily what we have to expect. We're not necessarily expecting an entire cohort of traumatized people. Maybe if you can speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Yeah, so I looked into this quite systematically since I started looking at Bosnia, and almost all of the contexts that I've looked into, and I looked into South Sudan, Darfur, Palestine, forced young children who are living as forced migrants in across Europe following the so-called immigration crisis of 2015. By any measures, even people who went into the research attempting to measure and look for the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma, in terms of the long-term persistence of symptoms, I could not find studies that cited more than 50. Sometimes there was one study from Norway that cites 56% among long-term symptoms among migrants who have been severely mistreated while they were migrating. So somewhere between 10 and 50% of data shows somewhere between 10 and 50% of young people who went through periods of radical change will develop some symptoms of post-traumatic stress or emotional trauma. So, from the perspective of empirical psychological science, the question that always arises is, well, this is barely half of the sample. What happens with the rest of them? And then there's this other, also very nice narrative of resilience, which I also don't think it fully captures what happens. Because some people might be resilient because they've developed certain capacities beforehand. Some people might develop resilience during the time of acute crisis. But I think what I would like to highlight is that it's a complex and dynamic process, and that children and young people who go through the periods of radical change are not like everyone else, but they don't necessarily have to be emotionally traumatized or have suffered negative effects as part of being exposed to this crisis. And I think that there are many possible outcomes, and the outcomes, in the tradition of cultural psychology, are really dependent upon the activities and the mediation that is offered by the context during the period of radical change. If a child is exposed to firsthand casualties, massacres, loss of a place for everyday activities, chances of trauma are higher. But that's quite often not the case. Even if you look at refugee camps across the world, there are often some educational activities available, and there are multiple ways that people are dealing with these situations.
Gordana Jovanovic sends greetings from Belgrade and is asking you, as somebody, she says, as somebody who lived in former Yugoslavia, and you showed some data speaking in favor of Yugoslav achievements, I cannot get rid of the question how to understand such a radical change in adults who from neighbors almost overnight became enemies. How would you explain that radical change that happened?
That's a great question. I think there are, overlapping master narratives that were that existed following the World War II that were not successfully dealt with within our former socialist republic. That in order to pursue this modernization project that was started in 1945, a lot of times a lot of very difficult questions were brushed aside and not directly dealt with. The roles of different units after the Second World War or during the Second World War in the war atrocities. Also, I think it's important to point out that after 1945 in former Yugoslavia, there's basically a civil war that rages on for about 7 or 8 more years after the so-called liberation. And I think that inability of the political structures and the educational methodologies to integrate these various narratives that existed prior to the formation of the Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia laid, I think, a fertile ground for the nationalism to erupt. And then, you had the larger geopolitical transformations in Eastern Europe or in Europe in general at the beginning of 1990s, which sort of fractured the context and set set these narratives free. But I'm also surprised by the viciousness with which former neighbors are relating to each other, even now, 25, 30 years later.
Sonia Bloom is asking, first of all, saying, thank you, Luca, for a fantastic talk. And she says, in the current pandemic, there is a gradient of change, a greater or lesser impact of COVID pandemic in different parts of the US or the world. How do you think this difference in experience will translate into a gradient of change in individuals and the implications of this? Maybe also stemming from the experience that you have with your research.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, because I think it again goes to show that there's not a homogeneous experience of living through a lockdown or through living through COVID. I think that the context have been the hardest hit, like some parts of Italy, Spain, some parts of China, some parts of the United States by the epidemic, and in response have had the most severe lockdowns, which then expose people to these periods of prolonged isolation, will leave their mark the most significantly. I think that if we compare them to some other context where both the disease and the reactions, the lockdowns, were not as severe, people change during prolonged periods of radical change, and that's what I try to sort of capture with this experience of space and time. I think they're very basic categories of human existence, and when you change somebody's experience of space or their experience of time for a long enough period, I think they start to think differently and feel differently. You can always already see it. For example, in New York City, the number of people who are entertaining the options of taking public transportation, a number of people who are entertaining the options of congregating in large groups and so forth and so on, where I think we are looking at some, perhaps not extremely long-term changes, but in the not foreseeable, but in the next few years, we will feel some changes in our lifestyles and in the ways that we react to each other and relate to each other.
Do you think that those changes could also be captured in a similar way that you have captured them in the narratives that you have researched?
I was thinking about it. I mean, the reason why one of the reasons why I decided to do the study in Bosnia in 2015 is I thought that enough time has elapsed for us to develop some critical assessment of the situation of the 1990s. And then from the vantage point of being a psychologist, you cannot wait 200 years, right? As a historian would. 25 years is, I think, good enough to have some critical perspective and yet have people remember what happened then. So I think that perhaps now it's a bit early. I think we need to get through this and then examine it. But I think that there would be a way, especially with young children. For them this is a big change, and it will be a significant sort of very highlighted event in their lives that I think would be worth researching and worth looking into how their experience of others and behaviors and feelings changed during this time. I've often thought how it's perhaps easier for me to go through this period than somebody who's 13, 14, 15 years of age. Just the significance of interpersonal interactions at these ages is so much more pronounced than at some later age. So perhaps I think it would be important to study it in a few years.
Irene is pressing this issue a little bit with her question here and saying that the unwar spaces that you describe, did they also function, in your opinion, as a form of safe space that maybe also relates to the findings that we didn't have such a large number of post-traumatic stress disorder? And is maybe this unwar spaces in a particular configuration, is that what we need right now, rather than I don't want to say dramatization, but like a constant reiteration maybe of the war metaphor. Instead, maybe we have to rely maybe more on unwar space metaphor, something like that, that will help our youth?
I mean, that's a great question. So the things that I can offer at this point is that, yes, there were many unwar spaces and they were mainly collective in nature. So even the most individualized activities that you would perform by yourself in a pre-war time, like reading, became collective activities during the siege. And I think that this is really important. And Sonia, who asked the previous question, made a similar point in her talk, that it's really by collectivizing our activities and our ways of relating to the world that we have the opportunity to shield ourselves from some of the negative consequences of very radical changes. I think that education and the existence of these unwar spaces greatly contributed to and ameliorated the direct effects of the siege. I have in the article that recently came out, participants who went on record saying, like 1 hour of education a day was basically what my life revolved around. That everything in my life was structured around this 1 hour of instructions, and I felt alive during this 1 hour, and the other 23 hours during the siege, in the shelters, in the basements, hiding were preparation for this 1 hour of structured learning and development.
Courtney is directly connecting to that with the question of what you might take from your findings there, that schools continued despite what was going on, and what you said before, that we now have this constant discussion whether schools should continue or not, whether we can, from the situation that we're in right now, take something with us to reinvent maybe education, schooling, where we could take this from there.
Yeah, I think both. I think we can learn from previous crises that given a long enough timeline, young people found in-person educational activities extremely beneficial. There were, of course, times, just like now, when they were unable to hold in-person educational activities, but there were also times when there was a lot of danger in the air and in the environment, where teachers and students decided to come together and invent and come up with ways in which they could safely do that. And I think we are again, facing a similar paradigm. Like, is there a way for us to, of course, we cannot convene schools in the ways that we did 3-4 months ago before the pandemic, but is the answer only to offline education and not try to convene in-person classes? I'm not sure. I think that there are, to use the term of environmental affordance, or almost like environmental crutch in this situation where we're being a bit challenged, that we can come up with and still hold in-person activities. I mean, we see a lot of examples of this, for example, in Taiwan, where they have successfully developed tools that they use in classrooms, like physical barriers that sit on children's desks in order to prevent the spread of the disease, and so forth and so on. Classes that are staggered in terms of different shifts during the day, where you would minimize the number of students, or not minimize, but optimize the number of students for the situation, so that you don't have, let's say, 30 children sitting in the same classroom, but you have 10 of them in 3 different shifts. There are multiple ways that we can think through this. There is not just this binary, either we send kids back to school in a pre-epidemic, pre-pandemic way, or have everything mediated online. And I also think that, as we're finding out, I think we can utilize the online resources much more in teaching. I myself was a bit hesitant to do that, but then I started teaching a few days ago and found out that it's actually quite pleasurable and it works. I'm not sure if I would solely like to teach online as a professor in my life as my career, but from time to time, it rather than canceling classes for not being able to be there in person, it's a serious possibility that should be entertained and utilized.
We're already running out of time. Time always moves fast here, and there's so many more things that I would like to ask you, but maybe you can just quickly give me an idea what you think, where you're going to take your research trajectory, where are we going from here? I'm fascinated with this, with the parallel that you made there to say the siege was essentially a form of lockdown. There are many ways in which this can be compared to the situation. Where are we now? Do you think that in order also for the future to understand the scenario that we live through right now, are more historical comparisons helpful to understand our own situation right now? And if so, do you have ideas where we could connect to, where we could take our research?
Well, I mean, for me personally, the reason why I started writing that the work on war schools is I was sort of stimulated by the current environment that found schooling so challenging, and I wanted to offer some historical example where this challenge was dealt with in some way, shape, or form. As Freud always told us, the reason why we explore the past is not necessarily for past's sake, but because if we don't know the past, the more muddled and insecure our response to the future is going to be. I think that it's important to be mindful of past examples. There are many crises that we have overcome as people, and use those examples currently. But I also think that right now it's the time to think creatively about some solutions to our crisis, because even if we deal effectively, I think, with the COVID-19, which I don't doubt we will in time, there are serious sociocultural ramifications, like Sunil pointed out in the talk earlier today, that fall along very traditional sort of cultural lines. And also, I'm certain this is not the last crisis that we're going to face. Conditions of forced migration, wars, environmental degradation proliferating. One of the ways I thought of starting this talk a few months ago was by saying that there was children who were displaced from their schools in a town called Paradise, California, because there were mudslides over there. The name of the town is Paradise, California. So this is not, as much as this is a class issue, and it's a huge issue there, it affects everyone in certain ways. And I think we need to find effective ways of continuing the social functions that we had, that we are used to in the future in situations of crisis.
Luca, thank you so much. Our time is already up, but I think that you, as I said before, you're adding yet another perspective to our discussions here, specifically with your descriptions of space and how space changes around people. I love that. And we think more about also the educational aspects. It was great to talk to you, and let's keep the discussion going in the future.
Thank you very much.
Talk soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Luca.